Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for being so punctual and for coming. After a pretty intense session this morning, now this afternoon we're going to actually change subject. And if you'll allow me, we've got for that task an exceptional speaker, not because I'm her friend, but because Cristina Narbona is undoubtedly a Spanish benchmark at an international level in the issue of energy and climate change. Cristina Narbona, there's been all sorts of things in Spanish politics, but Cristina Narbona is an economist. She's got a degree from the Sapienza University in Rome. She's held high-level office, both at the Andalusian regional government, nationally, and with the permission of the High Representative, and I hope you don't get cross with me, he was also the environmental minister in Spain, but she was what we could call the climate minister, because she was the environment minister, i.e. it wasn't just something else in addition to environment, but it was just environment. After having been minister, climate ministry, she followed an active policy. She was deputy president of the Senate in the previous period of government. She's also the president of the Socialist Party. But as you can see, she's also got an academic background. She's responsible for thought, as it were, and that goes beyond institutional matters. Christina's been advisor to the UN and has advised on issues relating to the 2030 agenda. She's taken part in many international and national panelists on the environment, or the environmental health, perhaps we could call it. So it's true, luxury. Well, she was a friend, as I already said, she's a friend. So without further ado, Cristina, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Paco, and thanks to everybody for spending some time this afternoon with us. I'm going to try not to be too complex in my analysis. We're going to start with some basic issues, which in our case is energy. Energy is a part of your EU policies in the geopolitical context where we find ourselves. Energy isn't just one other sector. It's not just one other asset. It's a very necessary asset for any economic activity. All economic activities needs that energy be available, accessible and affordable energy, and it's therefore a mainstream policy, a policy regarding a strategic good, a strategic asset that helps society progress in general. And this means that in many countries, it's energy that is in public hands. It's very regulated on many occasions. There are monopolies in the energy sector, which led to something a lot broader than oligopoly, but it's a strategic sector, and therefore it's a sector which has a key role in relations between the EU and the rest of the world, and that's been spoken about when people have spoken about our relations with Russia and what that's triggered. And we need to remember that the EU has a certain set of conditions to be able to become a global player in this sense. Firstly, because the EU is one of the main trading blocs in the world. Together with the US and China, we have a single market of 450 million people, 18% of the world's GDP, and approximately 16% of total exports and imports. Exports, we've got a slight advantage with China, and imports with a slight advantage in the US, but we're a very powerful market. regarding trade interdependence. And the European Union has what's called soft power, which is its ability to influence beyond defense and security via the setting up of standards, of regulations, and also via innovation. In the case of renewable energies, the EU has taken some tremendous step forwards, and what's more, EU is still building free trade areas, is still broadening its trade, its open trade interdependence, like other parts of the world. It trades a lot with Japan, for example, and also with Mercosur. But at the end of the day, EU does play the role of a relevant actor. It's also true that what we know today as the European Union or the EU, is predecessed by actually an energy treaty, which was the European Community for Coal and Steel. That was founded in 1950 precisely to be able to manage jointly two very important raw materials for industrial development of the 6 founding countries of the European Union. When you see what these CECA meant, you can see how they were ahead of their times. Some things that they saw haven't come true, but they, for example, managed to harmonize external trade taxes. It fought against dumping. So there was the political will right before the European Community existed, linked in this case to coal, which in that case was the one of the biggest raw materials for energy that there was. What's more, a few years later, in 1956, when the Rome Treaty was signed, Eurotom was also created. Eurotom is the European Community for Atomic Energy. That just goes, once again, to show the political will of the 6 founding nations to drive forward in a coordinated fashion peaceful development of energy, of nuclear energy. So we're talking about something that's actually become part of the history of the European Union. And it's, as I said at the beginning, been as a result of some requirements. We need to have safe energy supply. It needs to be affordable, i.e. the energy needs to be as cheap as possible, and it needs to be accessible for any economic activities, for any development of our societies. Thing is, gradually, energy policy, the EU's energy policy, which has allowed each of its member states to have their own energy mix. Each country can independently decide what sort of energy mix they want. But because of agreements in climate change, there's been a gradual incorporation of environmental goals into energy goals. This is clear since 2015. There's a climate plus energy approach to things. And this is the approach, by the way, which our government has copied in its current ministerial structure. Energy and the environment are in the same government department in Spain. And Juncker's Commission in 2015 tried to use this integrated approach to try to reach the EU Energy Union. The European Energy Union hasn't been developed so much, but we now do find ourselves in a situation in which we need to think far more closely about an integrated approach to climate goals and more strictly energy goals and the supply and accessibility and affordability of energy. This has been something that's been recognized ever since von der Leyen came to power in 2019. The Green Deal was approved by the Commission, where there we saw energy transition and environmental transition as a true vector to make the European Union by 2050 the first major carbon neutral economy, the first area on the planet where there's no net emissions of greenhouse gases. That brings us right up to date. And the current situation we're seeing is being affected by the Ukraine war. The Ukraine Overseas Affairs Minister said on the first day that the EU needs to reinvent itself and that wars make history go faster. That's true also for energy, because undoubtedly if it was already necessary to move away from this terrible dependency on fossil fuels in general, and more specifically those fossil fuels that come from a third country that turns out to have a more difficult relationship than we may have thought of a few years ago, we also find that not only do we have a war in Ukraine, there's another war which is affecting thousands of lives and thousands of euros, millions of euros in losses, which is climate change. And climate change has accelerated in recent months far more than in recent years. The EU is an area where the devastating effects of climate change are seen quite crudely. This year we're having heat waves, which are even worse than last year. Slovenia has been devastated by floods. There are huge forest fires, which experts have now called wildfires. They're what they call sixth-generation uncontrollable fires. All of this, which goes hand in hand with drought and something that's affecting many, many economic activities. But let's start with the deaths, those who die. How many people are dying due to climate change in Europe? A most recent report that we've read indicates that last year 60,000 people died in the EU as a result of heat waves. And included within these 60,000 people dead, there are people who die early because of their ill health, and an excess of heat actually brings death on quicker, in addition to pollution and other problems. But so heat waves do kill. In Italy, 15,000 deaths, and in Spain, 11,000. So we're talking here about another war that affects and conditions this need to step up the energy transition and considerations of climate change as a policy priority. Not just because people die, we're talking here about very serious problems arising from climate change on agriculture, on livestock. We're seeing it now in tourism. So the economic effects of climate change are being felt. In fact, so much so that the European response has to be to accelerate a roadmap which had actually already been designed before the Ukraine war, and which had been designed before this uptick in climate change, which experts are now telling us about their effects, and this needs to be taken into account by all the political authorities in our countries. So having seen what's happened in recent years, remember, as we said, that in 2019 the Green Deal was passed, and in 2021, this is before the Ukraine war that started in 2022, the European Climate Act was passed. When people talk about a European Climate Act, what I'm talking about is a regulation which has to be immediately applied by member states, and there are several of them. The first was this European Climate Act in 2021. 2021, after what had been set out in the Green Deal and Next Generation funds, 40% of which are going to be spent on the environmental transition, what the Commission decides to set its sights higher and commit to reducing greenhouse gases by 2030. Just to give you an idea, since 1990 to date, all the countries of the EU have reduced by over 30% their greenhouse gas emissions, whilst the GDP of the EU has increased over this period by almost 50%. So I'm talking about the whole of the EU's. There's been this complete decoupling between economic growth and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And as well as this decoupling and the effort required to reduce the effects of greenhouse gases, the European climate sets out the need to increase the weight of renewable energy mixes of each country, and it asks each country to set out a national plan for energy and climate. Within this general approach, which includes looking at climate and energy together, and these comprehensive national energy and climate plans, each country informs the EU of the measures that are taken and what its targets are. Spain has sent to the EU, to the Commission, recently its second version of its national plan, where it increases its ambition regarding the path for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I ought to mention now just Spain, because there's some graphs that show us how in Spain the importance of renewable energies is going up. If you look at where we were and where we are now, you see that if there's political will, we can make progress in our energy mix. It is feasible, and you can see the results of that. Spain is considered by the European Commission as one of the countries with the greatest ambition. Electricity production mix this year, over half the production of electricity comes from renewable energy sources, and what's more, we are going further in the urgent side of things, which is the ability to store renewable energies to make up for the fact that these energy sources are produced intermittently. A lot of research is being made into green hydrogen, the possibility of producing hydrogen from renewable energies, and then the efforts required to electrifying certain industries so that they can consume directly renewable energies, for example, in transport, sea transport, especially road transport as well, but also try to find possibilities to replace gas in sectors where large amounts of gas are used and where the green hydrogen solution is probably the most appropriate. And then war happened. Then war broke out. What happens after war breaks out? Something that we ought to recognize and be proud of is the very swift reaction of community institutions after this war broke out. The war broke out in February, and by March, there was already a Commission document which was called the Repower EU plan, the idea to give energy to the EU. You've got references to that for anybody that wants to see it in detail. And it's a plan which concentrates on all those vectors and transition to a decarbonized economy, and how by implementing these investments, these changes to different models, transport models, edification models. These Repower EU had its first version a few days after the war was broken out in Ukraine, and in May it was presented together with another document, which is the EU's overseas strategy in energy. This is a thorough document where you can see by different geographical areas the possibilities that the EU has to diversify, reduce its dependency, find new suppliers, increase the deployment process of renewable energies. It's all in the Repower EU plan, and it is part of a broader overseas policy in May, as I said, just a couple of months after the war started. From then onwards, other initiatives were being taken. I believe these are very important. For example, the creation of a platform for public purchasing for member states, something which is thanks to the decision to create a platform to publicly procure vaccines together, i.e. it's a coordinated position of member countries. Obviously, you have to give over part of your sovereignty, but it allows you to access certain urgent and necessary products. From then onwards, there's this, also in 2023, in this case, two proposals from the Commission, which are very important. One is a law that is proposed for an industry with net zero emissions. It's called Net Zero Industry, which is the EU's reply to the law that was passed in the US, which, despite its aim being to reduce inflation, it's an Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually a decision by the US and which is really related to boosting renewable energies, hydrogens, grid operations, etc. So this decision that was taken last year by the Biden administration, the European Commission has proposed this European Act for a zero carbon EU industry. The aim here is that inside the EU, not only do we produce renewable energy, but that key components be produced for obtaining renewable energy. The energy that we get from the sun, from the Earth's heat, from wind, these are actually free resources that we can find almost anywhere. But to be able to make better use of them, we need technologies and a whole value chain where we find that many of these links in the value chain weren't being produced in the EU. So energy transition also means making progress in this strategic autonomy of the EU. So the EU doesn't completely depend on purchasing certain raw materials or certain products in the value chain of our wind turbines or our solar panels. Of course, it's an ambitious goal, but with the public assistance of accessing the European Union, these are goals that are feasible. Of course, always if there's the political will to understand that this is the road to follow. This bill has still not been passed, and there's now a second bill, which is very closely linked to all of this subject, which is a bill for raw materials that are key or critical. And we're talking here about lithium, cobalt, rare earths. Many of these raw materials cannot be found inside Europe. And what this act, if it's passed, will aim to do, in addition to making ties with these countries, but also within the EU, as much as possible, obtain raw materials. There's a certain margin from a viewpoint of mining resources of the EU which has still not been exploited. And once there is something mined, it's easier once you've got the raw materials to treat them, transform them and recycle them. Why is recycling key? Because we're talking here about raw materials that aren't infinite. We're talking here about raw materials at the rate that we're going at, and the idea of electrification of vehicles and using a different energy source 20 to 30 years from now, there'll probably be physical limits to obtaining these raw materials that are so necessary. So everything that makes us more able to recycle or to once again get products from raw materials that have already been used will put the EU in a situation in which it can compete to obtain key raw materials. What else does the EU have today? One, which has been strongly backed by our government, which is the reform of the electricity market. In other courses that you've attended, I know we've been able to talk about the current electricity market, the fact that it doesn't guarantee, and far from it, that the reduction of costs in energy, in renewable energies that are increasingly cheap, be transferred to those who consume energy. Because in the retail market or the wholesale market, there's a price stipulating which means that these are equal to the most expensive price, normally gas. That means that there are a series of producers whose energy resources are actually cheaper than gas. This is like benefits that just one-off benefits, because the consumers are paying for electricity for a higher price than if the electricity was actually calculated from price viewpoint in accordance with the kind of technologies that are used.
And Spain is analyzing the proposal of the European Commission. President of the Commission, Madam van der Leyen, already talked about the need of this reform and talked about this reform that had to be an in-depth and urgent reform. It is true that now, from the viewpoint of the Spanish government, it doesn't seem to be perfect. In fact, it is believed that it can be improved. And if you want to have a full knowledge, I recommend the reading of the study by Natalia Fabra that will be published very soon, who is one of the main experts, not only in Spain, but also in Europe regarding energy economy. So we have the reform of the electric market, which has as one of its main aims that the reduction in the cost of renewable energies has a favorable effect on the consumers, and that we don't depend on the volatility of the prices of a resource like gas that is mainly coming from outside the borders of the EU. It has been allowed and extended the authorization to Spain so that it can establish limits regarding gas price, in fact, to avoid the negative impact that we had because of the Ukraine war, because as you know, we have an inflation that has affected society. And also, amongst other things, the EU from the 1st of October will establish a mechanism to adjust prices at the border with a CO2 fee that won't generate an income till 2026. So we'll start with a transition stage since October this year for those products imported from third countries. And that are linked to the CO2 emissions or price inside the borders, so that there's no dumping of products that come from outside our borders and that have generated CO2 emissions compared to what we produce here, that is already paying for the CO2 emissions inside the emissions rights European standard. This is another very significant step. It won't have immediate effects, as I've explained, but this means going beyond a taboo that we had regarding how to organize ourselves compared to the rest of the world. I would like to finish by talking about some of the challenges and opportunities of the energy transition in the situation nowadays for the EU. The challenge that has already been mentioned is the difficulty in the decision-making process, because many of the decisions that have to do with our both foreign affairs and energy have to do with unanimity, and with 27 so heterogeneous in their energy mix and in their relationships with third countries, it is obvious that this is a hurdle, a challenge, and I always ask myself, why aren't we able to do the same things that we were able to do with the euro regarding this issue? Those countries that want to go at a higher speed can do so, and that won't break the EU. But if we all have to agree on issues having to do with energy transition and relationships with third parties, we will be slower. The second big challenge is the social and therefore political challenge. The social unrest or discomfort that has been generated in specific sectors in our society because of energy transition decisions is clear. In Spain, we have, for example, in many places, the rejection of the deployment of renewables, for example, big wind farms, or in France we had the yellow jackets because of the fuel's price. And now, because of issues that have to do with climate change, we have unease regarding the availability of water for agriculture. So these unease exist. And what's curious, and this is being used by political forces that in some cases deny climate change and therefore consider that this idea of having limits on CO2 is a religion. They call it a climate religion. And there's some that not only deny, but others that delay decision making. And in fact, we have to see what is happening in Spain nowadays. We have 140 town councils governed by PP and Vox, and some of them started to make decisions that go steps back regarding the reduction of CO2 emissions. For example, taking away bike paths so that there's more cars and that cars can continue polluting. This have effects on health, but also on the economy, because this bike lanes were on some occasions funded by the EU, and sometimes we have to give back this money. And this is not only happening in Spain. Also in Italy, Madame Meloni has changed her national plan linked to the Next Generation funds. And this means that the European Commission has stopped the allocation of money because projects and the orientation of these projects has changed so much regarding energy transition that right now there is a situation of impasse with Italy. So there are social challenges that can only be solved taking into account this just or fair transition policy. and that is by acknowledging that there's losers and winners in the energy transition. Be aware of those regions that need support, public support, and the fostering of employment creation. In Spain, there are regions where this is being developed in a successful manner. For example, Asturias, where a few years back we couldn't even imagine that there will be a full disappearance of mining and thermal plants, and how this has been done in agreement with workers, businesses, town councils, autonomous region government, and the university. So new jobs have been generated as well as new activities, and the fair transition in the case of coal mining in Asturias is has set an example also outside our borders of how we need a fair transition. Some other challenges have to do with technology. I have already mentioned the difficulty of developing renewable energies and electrification when there's raw materials that we don't have in Europe, and therefore we need strategic alliances like the ones that have started to be established. And talking about opportunities, but because we don't not only have challenges, the European Commission reports estimate that if we develop the roadmap of the Green Deal till 2030, we will have 1 million new jobs, net jobs. And this will provide also a good position for the EU at an international level regarding innovation. And that is innovation and new agreements with broad sectors of third parties. For example, recently, and due to the summit between Latin America and Caribbean countries and the EU, we had the signing of 130 projects in the Global Gateway Initiative. And the aim is to develop investments linked to the deployment of renewable energies, green hydrogen, and also obtaining critical raw materials, electrification of transport, and through this manner the EU can broaden its influence in the rest of the world and can build in this multipolar world a geopolitical position that is more convenient than just looking into itself. And I remind you that when we speak about ecological transition and energy transition, the cost of not doing anything is much higher than the costs that we will have to address in future years. And unfortunately, this is more and more clear with time, and therefore we have to be responsible, both local and national governments, as well as businesses, and the citizenship in general needs to be responsible so that we can progress in the fastest way possible, because the climate emergency is no joke. It's something that we're clearly observing this year, and there are solutions and things that can be done at a EU level. We can do much better than working separately. Thank you.
Perdón, con permiso de...
Before we start with a Q&A session, in the bibliography that Cristina sent us, there is an article published in July 2023 by José Luis Escario, who is here today. So I would like to give him the floor so that he can talk about the article. José Luis, if there's anything you want to say or add, that will be very interesting for us. Thank you. Well, I have very little to add because she's giving a very comprehensive vision of the problem. The only thing I could add is maybe the issue that I mentioned the other day, and that is the industrial policy of the Green Deal in the context of the programs with aids from US and Japan. So how could we defend our system, which is the system that has been up and running since 2005 regarding prices on CO2 emissions, but at the same time be competitive, taking into account these new strategies, and of course from China that since 2015 has had an economic planning. So how can we find our position as the EU in this context? Thank you, José Luis. I was very interested in your article because it was a very recent one, and even though it's not a long, it does look into all the points that have to do with the presidency of Spain of the EU. And I would, if you will allow me, say that during this 6-month period, the aim of the government is to progress as much as possible. As I said before, in the electric market reform, there's so much at stake. We need to solve adequately the way in which we set prices. In fact, to be able to increase competitiveness of our businesses. Because how can we compete with the rest of the world with a system to set prices like the one we have nowadays? Also, the bill that I mentioned before, the European bill for zero CO2 emissions and the reform of the electric market, something that you mentioned in the article, is a central element to increase the competitiveness of the European businesses and to alleviate the load or what this means for the economies of families and households. So this is an issue that is very present throughout the Spanish presidency of the EU. Also through the presidency, we are working on this, reinforcing the association and the link with Latin American and Caribbean countries, where Spain is a fundamental lever. I would also like to mention something that Professor Aurea Molto mentioned yesterday or the day before yesterday. That is that Spain needs to be aware of the neighboring countries, not only the link to Latin America, but also to sub-Saharan countries and countries in Northern Africa, in the future scenario for relationships with third countries, also in energy. And if you will allow me, another element that I believe is fundamental is that in the presidency of the Council of the EU, there is a rule that has already gone through the Parliament and will be finally approved. And this is a standard, or it was difficult to pass because many in the Popular Party in Europe have voted together with extreme right to vote against this law on the restoration of nature that is very much linked to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And now we start and continue with the process, and the Spanish presidency wants to give this decision-making process the maximum urgency. This is one of the elements that will be important for us. And also reform of the electric market, which is fundamental to be able to compete at an international level. And I would also add something that is one of the articles, because the European law for zero emissions industry takes into account too many different types of investments for the limited budget. So we observe that under the umbrella of this law or act, we want to finance mini nuclear reactors and also other operations on the capture and storage of CO2, which is highly costly. While the American law focuses on less things, and I believe it is very correct, because as we don't have unlimited budget, we need to have priorities, which is renewable energies, electrification, storage. Okay, so now we have gone to the Q&A session, and I see there's 1, 2, 3 questions. Uribe, 4. Okay, 4. You have the floor. Thank you, Paco. Thank you, Cristina, for your presentation. A very clear presentation, and also one in which I learned. This is a dilemma, or maybe we're trying to find a balance in some of the things that have already been mentioned, and José Luis Escari also mentioned them. It is obvious, and you've mentioned that we find ourselves in a climate emergency, and with everything that this means. So this is the umbrella under which we find ourselves, which means, as you've said, that we need to accelerate the roadmap for energy transition. However, on the other hand, we have to look into how all of this is developed and the necessary protection of the industry, the industrial sector in the Basque Country. It's obvious that this is very important because this is the way in which we maintain our social welfare system. So how can we strike a balance, or is there a real dilemma? We've talked about the US law, the bill of the EU, but I believe we need to have an adequate compensation for the industry to be able to have a transition without losing any activity and without losing jobs, which I believe is really important. On the other hand, there is an industry working on clean energies, blades, parts for wind energy, for example, but I believe that we have to take into account what is happening with the classical industry that is digitizing itself. For example, the machine tool industry, the electro-intensive industry, and in fact you've mentioned them, and also the parts of the vehicle industry. So in the value chain of the generation of clean energy, let's not only focus on this, but on all other kinds of industries too. And finally, maybe my question is too naive, but someone might ask him or herself, is this something that will mean something if we don't have robust multilateral agreements at a global level? Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Cristina. It was a pleasure listening to you, and getting to know your career is very motivating for all young women like myself. My question has to do with health and climate. All respiratory illnesses that we have now could disappear if we didn't have the level of pollution. And in fact, a Nobel laureate that I had the chance of discussing this with also mentioned this. Shouldn't we insist more on this so that people that do not believe on climate change really can realize what is happening, and they can change their minds? And of this 140 projects that you've mentioned, I would like to know if you take into account food security and water scarcity, with all of the uncertainty that we live in, not only derived from the war, but also from inflation and other situations we go through in the world. I would also like to know if you have thought about investing in health, because we need to educate children on the risks of climate change too. And I know there's no crystal ball, but I would like to ask about the future. Can we somehow work in a preventive manner so what is happening in Italy doesn't happen here? If there is a change in government, if the extreme right or the right become stronger, what can we do to avoid the situation that Italy has? Thank you. Thank you so much. We have two more on the back, and then we will have a second round of questions.
For this very complete presentation of the European policy on green transition. This policy is based principally on high carbon price and strict norms on the industry, on the products, and so on. It seems very logical and coherent and so on. But the problem is that the rest of the world is now having a very different policy, and in particular the US with the IRA. If you give grants to the people, it's the same from the economic point of view than to have a high carbon price, but it's much more simple to sell to voters, to give subventions, to give grants, than to have a higher taxation and higher energy price. We were on that track because we believed until now that the rest of the world will have a carbon price in the future, but it's not the way it is going now. Isn't the Green Deal now with the IRA becoming obsolete?
Si les parece, como tenemos tres preguntas.
As we have three questions, I believe maybe Cristina should answer these questions, and then we would have a second round of questions. Thank you.
Vale, muy bien. Bueno, pues entonces, Luc.
Okay. When we speak about helping energy transition in the industry, we include all sectors, not only the promotion of those industries that are part of the value chain of solar panels or wind turbines. No, we're speaking about providing financial support to all industrial sectors so that in all sectors we have the possibility of reducing greenhouse effect emissions. In some cases, through the direct use of renewable energies. And about this, in Spain, we do have some examples that are very interesting. We have companies in the industry sector that are working in areas where there are projects of big photovoltaic farms to be able to have access to this energy. And as you mentioned before, there's a special treatment on behalf of the government to the electro-intensive industries that have received, at least before the Ukraine war, they were receiving specific aid, taking into account the difficulties that they face. And also we should continue, I believe, working in this way. And if the bill that I mentioned, the European bill, is passed, the national industrial policies can have a complement. And if we look at all the different programs that have to do with recovery, transformation, and resilience, in most cases, they have an effect on the industrial sectors, for example, the automotive sector. So the transition process that we find ourselves in is going to encourage more investors at a national and international level to develop their activity in our country. For example, we have the biggest world company in the manufacturing of containers in Spain, and they will be the ones working on green hydrogen. It is a very high investment with many zeros. I can't even remember the figures, with, of course, job creation. And as I mentioned before, the transition has to be a fair transition, because if people see that we substitute one activity for another, and that means that people are unemployed, we will face very serious problems. And at a European level, we have the Climate Social Fund. In Spain, we have the Institute for Fair Transition. And as I pointed out before, they've had very successful experiences, like in the case of coal mining and thermal plants. And of course, the Basque Country is a wonderful example of connection between the industry, university, and internationalization processes of our economy. That's why I am convinced that once again in the Basque Country, we will have a situation of job creation, even though there is a energy transition, because your industry is more diversified and internationalized than other regions in Spain. Therefore, we have to be optimistic regarding this. And if I believe that from Spain and the EU we're speaking about this way of progressing, well, I think that what we cannot do is not to give steps forward. Can we leave things as they are? We can, but the cost of not doing anything is much higher than the cost of doing things. And in fact, there are already reports from renowned economists that insist on this idea. Should we stop being concerned about climate change because not everyone is concerned? Well, be aware that everyone is concerned. China is investing at an industrial level, in fact, in sectors that have to do with renewables and electrification and so on. And also the US, with this last law, has focused on renewable energies. And if I haven't said this before, I have to add this. One of the big advantages that Spain has for this energy transition is the fact that our grid, the Spanish grid, is an infrastructure of high quality that is able to manage intermittent energies in a very successful manner. In fact, it is one of the most visited infrastructures by leaders and technicians from other countries, because it's not common. There's countries that have very deficient grids, even in Europe. It's the case of Germany. Germany had really progressed in wind and solar energy, but a great amount of the wind energy produced in the north of Germany doesn't reach the south of Germany, because the electric grid in Germany has many deficiencies and for many years has had a very low investment level. Therefore, there too we need to be aware of elements that are positive for the competitiveness of Spain. And if we are able to move forward in the interconnections, both the electric as the green hydrogen interconnections for the future, we have the opportunity of benefiting financially from energy transition.
Panama asked me about health, climate, pollution matters. We now have a lot of information about what's going on, about how bronchiolitis and allergies have increased in children and in adults. The increasing number of people in Spain who breathe bad quality air, and early deaths that causes. in addition to the effects of heat waves. We've got different kinds of pollution in addition to that, heat waves, and sometimes both of them together. And this should, in public opinion, make people demand that we look after climate in our cities, where you get the greatest population concentration and where you find in many cases, instead of planting more trees, they remove them. And every time we add cement and remove trees, that means temperature will go up and pollution increases, because trees absorb CO2 and pollution, reduce temperature and increase humidity. So everything that can be done in this sense should be asked for, and in fact is being asked for increasingly so by the public. And as you are a member of an NGO and you have many youngsters in your NGO, I'd say the most interesting experience that I've seen in most recent years is what was called the Citizens Climate Assembly, where the Ministry for the Environmental Transition asked 100 people, the majority of whom were under the age of 30, to take part in the process for drawing up the comprehensive plan for energy and climate. And the conclusions from that summit have been used partly to modify upwards the Spanish government's climate goals, and have also accelerated the engagement of youngsters and a more structured organization, which I feel is key. It's vital, firstly, so that the public knows that pollution, climate change have a negative effect on our health. And nationally, there's already a national health and environment plan, a Health and Climate Change Observatory has been opened. So we do have tools. We've got knowledge, scientific knowledge and information about public participation, so that public opinion can get mobilized and demand responses. So, for example, so as not to remove bike lanes or to not uproot trees in Madrid. Otherwise, it's going to become a wasteland, because green spaces are disappearing so as to increase spaces containing cement, and that is going to lead to greater heat accumulation and pollution. As for how to prevent the progress of certain populist movements, I think democracy is fought with more and better democracy, therefore generating as much public debate, of public engagement in decision-making processes, and fostering the best information possible. I'm convinced that even today, in a society such as ours, which has access to many information sources, there are still many people who think that removing bike lanes and there are more cars running in a city actually isn't going to affect their lives very much. So more information, more participation, more public access to the public debate in these subjects, so that simple solutions, and people who say that, oh, it's always been hot, climate change doesn't exist, don't just make us think, oh, yes, climate change exists, but we can't do anything about it. We need to fight against that feeling, because, of course, things can be done, not just to avoid the advance of climate change, but also to adapt to temperatures which possibly, even if we do reduce emissions, are still going to be higher than in the past. There will be more extreme phenomena, and society needs to be prepared for that. We need to make more livable cities, more resistant structures, and we need to know that maybe our beaches 5 years from now won't be as an attractive a thing as they were in the past. All of this needs to get into the minds, not just of politicians, but of the public as well, so that democratically they choose the political options that can help them solve these problems and not just leave them out, which is the temptation. Alexis pointed out the difference between the way energy transition is treated in some geographical areas as opposed to in others. But I want to say that both in China, which until recently the issue of climate change, the advance of renewable energies wasn't a priority, but now is a part of China's political agenda to lead production in all the field of renewable energies. And faced with that, I think, Europe has a lot to say and a lot to do. And also with regard to the US, that's why it's so important that industries and businesses in Europe have conditions for costs which make us more competitive. Because this is a way, in addition to subsidies and public aid and tax breaks in general, electricity prices should reflect the increasing costs, decreasing costs of renewable energy. So this is a regulatory change that we need to have in Europe. I know that there are civil servants. Won't be surprised that I'm highlighting this issue. Other people have asked to take the floor, but before giving the floor to you, there's somebody at the back there that asked to take the floor earlier. Thanks, firstly, Christina, for your explanation. I liked and enjoyed everything that you explained and the direction that Europe is following, as well as the direction followed by the Spanish government. But I think the directions that we're following and the path that we're following need to be told down to everybody, to the Joe in the street. And many people don't seem to realize that, especially in local government. As a representative of politics at a local government, I've seen that, and people don't seem to be concerned about climate change. And it may well be because we small towns and villages don't have the ability to intervene this at a local level. So I think it's really important that in upcoming years, all those plans that are deployed should include a series of resources and aids to small towns and villages so that all of this actually reaches everybody. And direct action is a great way of learning and helping people understand. I don't know what you feel about this. Thank you so much. For those of you who don't know, this is the mayor, the youngest man in the whole of Spain, the youngest man in the whole of Europe, who's just spoken to us.
Perdona, no recuerdo tu nombre.
Sorry, I don't remember your name. Gael, please. I've got two questions. Firstly, thanks for your talk. And secondly, has the government looked into the possibility of creating a public electricity company to compete with private companies so as to try to make sure that vulnerable homes actually receive energy and those that don't have power can access energy and to live? So there's always electricity, even in those people's homes who are vulnerable. And then the law, the act that you mentioned at an European level, does that encourage or envisage monies for fusion products that are being developed in France? Because that would, if it existed or if it came into force, create a great deal of energy generation. Good morning. Can you please give me your names? What's your name? Marcos. And what's your name? Guillermo. I am studying international relations and history, and firstly I'd like to say thank you for your talk. And then I realized that we're talking about a fair transition, and yet we forget that in reality, it's the wealthiest percentage that pollutes more than the most vulnerable parts of the population. I'd like to know whether, when faced with this inequality, are there no measures that are being put into operation? For example, I don't know, closing golf courses or limiting private aircraft use? Sorry. I've got 4 people that have asked to take the floor. We'll close with you, and then we'll move on to the next set. Please, a little bit of order here. Thank you. My name is Tomas Reyes. I'm an EU civil servant. We've debated in other sessions. And firstly, I'd like to ask the minister, thanks the minister for continually drawing our attention to the climate emergency and also doing it in an informal and calm way. I think it's really important to do things like that. And I was just wondering how much longer we're going to be able to maintain this calm, because it's really worrying. One of the figures that you shared with us and that really concerns me is the very, very short time scale that you gave us of 20 to 30 years until we should be concerned about true access to critical materials that we need. And this is related to another question, which is related to nuclear fusion. Is nuclear fusion something that we should keep in our mix? You didn't talk about the energy mix much. You didn't talk about nuclear energy. And maybe in this kind of emergency, especially in Spain, we should be thinking about the energy mix. One of the greatest difficulties that I have in my task is making any kind of declaration which reflects the energy priorities of the EU member states when we relate to other countries. It's just that there are so many different priorities. It's really impossible because you've got countries that have written into their constitution that you can't use nuclear power, and others that produce small nuclear reactors. It's really, really difficult to see how these positions can come together. I'm just wondering, and this is the second part of my question, what sort of energy safety guarantees do we have? Because this is the reflection that I get from the center and eastern part of Europe, of our partners, when they say, okay, this energy transition's great and renewable energy is great, but we want guarantees of energy security. Without these guarantees, we can't even join this debate on renewable energy. So I'd like to know what can be done from a European institutional viewpoint to try to improve this feeling of energy security, which our partners that don't have wind or they don't have sun maybe, or for historical reasons depend upon infrastructures that depend on Russian technology, and they're so concerned about that. So can you answer that? Let's begin with Gael. I'd love to provide you with all the information that you need about calls that have made this year for small towns, if you haven't been able to see them, because for European funds for the energy transition, there's quite a large part for small towns and villages to help in areas such as water management, which I think you said, which when you actually first arrived in the town hall, you had the major problem of providing clean water, which is a priority area. And there is money for town councils, especially for the small ones. There's been a series of calls. There have been far more requests than originally envisaged. And the environmental transition measure is handing out European funds, but there will be more. I'm sure we can have a look at how this. When you say that the people that live in your village still haven't clear in their mind the idea of climate change, they probably haven't seen the huge fire that you've had there. And these fires, and I know this, in our country, just like in other countries, has got a lot worse, a huge amount worse, because of the weather conditions, because of the soil quality and lack of moisture in the soil and other things related to high temperature. I think it's really important that people know that we are immersed in risks that are risks for our health, for economic activity, for the safety risk, security, whatever kind of risk you realize. Gael, for the tools that a local town has, such as town planning, water management, waste management, urban mobility, for all of this, energy sources, there is money for all of that, money from the EU. Spain is far quicker than other countries, but there's so money out there, but we're in a difficult situation, because sometimes there's sufficient human ability to manage all of this. So now we have difficulty in making all this aid trickle down. Marcos, you asked about whether a public company or a state-run company that would cover specific needs has been envisaged. What is envisaged is to improve support systems for vulnerable families, for vulnerable consumers, so there can't be any electricity supply cut off or heating supply cut off, especially those families that are vulnerable. Things have been proved in this sense with a definition of what vulnerable is, and whether there is or isn't a state company, and for the moment there isn't envisaged that there should be a state company. What we have envisaged is to carry on supporting self-generation. Self-generation means that we consume the energy that we produce, and it's one of the most interesting areas to try to modify the current electricity and to make this electricity market more democratic. Because it's moving away from a clear control by a few companies to what the EU wants, which is to empower consumers so that you get consumer producers. And there's a whole series of advantages to that. And in Spain, the data, you'll see that you can see how self-generation has increased, how initiatives taken by families, but also by companies. There's still a lot to be improved upon regarding European regulations, regarding the price that you paid for the energy that you upload onto the grid. This is a complaint. The Vice President knows that, because those of us who produce electricity, such as our case with solar panels, we've seen that there are some things that need to be looked into. But if they are looked into, and if we carry on supporting this idea of self-generation with assistance to buy solar panels, which are increasingly more normal in Spain, and a boost to regulation is going to help access to electricity in certain specific areas of our geography, which are far from big towns, and it is increasingly an option which is affordable. We want energy to be safe, clean, and also affordable. And that's being worked on, although, as I said earlier, there are no state-run companies envisaged. As for energy from fusion, nuclear fusion, something else that's come up in the last question, I don't remember for the moment when exactly this project I'm going to mention began, but when it was presented, there was a specific timeline, which we've also already gone beyond. There's now a longer timeline, but whatever considerations regarding technology and its characteristics, what I do want to highlight is that the situation and this terrible change in climate conditions is going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. All solutions that can be technologically justified as using energy sources that don't generate waste or CO2 need to be developed. The quicker the better, because and in certain specific projects require investment which will give rise to nuclear produced energy within a X number of years. The problem is the climate emergency is now, and it's getting quicker. So it's closing the window to different possibilities. Anything that can give us a reply 20, 30, 40, 50 years hence, maybe it might be great and is being supported. There is a technological, scientific effort to support that. The question is, when are we not going to be able to control climate change? And I say that with calm, but also with a huge amount of concern, because experts are telling us about this, and what experts see is that sea temperature is increasing so much that the incidence of this rise in temperature on ocean currents and on the atmosphere is far more serious than scientists and experts thought just 5 years ago. So let's be as quick as possible. Let's be aware of this. Let's not forget any kind of research line, any kind of technology that can provide us with a response. But let's be also aware of the fact that things are urgent now. And some of these technologies are still in the stage that they're at. And of course, the fact that the wealthy pollute means that there's an ethical challenge linked to climate change. Africans, as a whole, don't generate even 3% of emissions that affect climate change, and yet they're being clearly harmed by global warming. In general, we wealthy countries aren't accepting in a consistent way our commitment to poorer countries. In climate summits, what you hear is people shouting, where are the 100 billion euros that you promised us? That's what poorer countries are asking for from the wealthy countries in, for example, the Glasgow summit, or more recently, because we take decisions for developing nations, but then we don't adhere to them. There's always some excuse saying, oh, it's the COVID, oh, there's a Ukraine war, but actually at the end of the day, all of this creates great unease and means that large areas of the planet feel this malaise. And when countries see that, oh, you know, they're talking in Europe about electric cars, and who can actually buy electric car? I have to carry on using my car because I don't have the money to buy an electric car. So we talk about a fair transition, amongst other things. It's not just creating jobs, but also acting on price and acting on tax breaks. One of the commitments in the last general election is for there to be a in-depth tax reform so that it be more progressive than the current tax structure in our country, which is not very progressive. I pay the same taxes that people that earn 1,000 times more than me. And in addition to it being more progressive, the tax reform should go hand in hand with sustainability, environmental sustainability goals. These matters, I think, are of great priority so that our transition is fairer. As for golf courses, well, it's been repeated in more recent hydrological plans that have been put to the European Commission that golf courses should be watered exclusively with recycled water. And the Basque government has envisaged doubling the percentage of water reuse that's of course being treated both for watering and both for golf courses and also for the agricultural sector, which is where 80% of the water that we have in our country is consumed. As for flights, well, this is one of the things that in the Climate Assembly was raised and which is being studied, the issue of air transport and to what extent we should encourage transition from using planes to using trains. Some countries have made progress. They've even looked at cutting flights if you can cover the same amount of distance in equivalent time in a train. But what we're seeing in the aeronautical sector is to work on a regulation related to the use of biofuels, and progress may be made there. So that the difference in life standards between one another shouldn't be reflected today, which is quite clear, is that those who pollute have more. How long can we stay calm? That was one of the questions. Hopefully, we're able to keep a cool head, and hopefully we'll be able to make more people understand different public levels of responsibility, what we're talking about here. Because most recently, when I was sitting on the Senate, I've attended some debates that were surreal, especially when they spoke about the 2030 agenda and climate change, the kind of arguments that you hear people talking about a globalist agenda set out by world elites. These are things that have trickled down into Spanish public opinion to a certain extent and in other countries in recent months, which I think, and all those of us that believe that these issues are serious, all have our own field of responsibility of getting across the severity of the situation and the existence of alternatives, and always try to push as much as possible so that these alternatives actually happen.
And going to what is happening in France. France is a unique situation amongst the other EU countries, a country with a 70% of a dependency on nuclear energy. And the problem, beyond anything else, is that when there is such a significant production based on one source, in this case nuclear energy, this delays development and in fact has delayed in France the development of renewable energies. This year, France has had to stop more than half of its nuclear plants, some because they were obsolete and due to security reasons, others for the scarcity of water because of temperatures. And nuclear energy, like any other energy, has its pros and cons and specific conditions to be developed in a safe manner. And beyond any other consideration, and if we believe it's better or worse, the case of France and its extreme dependency means that some decisions are forced. For example, I believed that in green and taxonomy we shouldn't include the gas and natural and nuclear energy. No one denies that they are transition energy, but one thing is that, and the other is for them to have budgets allocated that would be more profitable and would speed up better in things if we would allocate this to renewable energies and the storage of these renewable energies, which is the thing we have to develop to be able to guarantee stability. That's why when I talked about the electric grid before, well, with all the renewable energy that Spain is using, we don't have one problem, not one single problem. The running from the supply standpoint is exceptional, and this is what we should be able to continue developing, and this is what we need the money for the electric grids to work well, because Germany is quite delayed in the running of its grid, and for it to be similar to ours. I believe I already answered the question that had to do with future projects linked to nuclear energy. Taking into account how long it will take to implement these technologies, not a prototype, but to be able to use them Urbi et Orbi. Because the problem of energy is a problem for Europe, Africa, Asia, and in Asia and in Africa, right now we are progressing in the generation of electricity from solar energy. If they had to wait to have a nuclear plant to be able to have electricity, this would take much more time, for sure. And therefore, I think we need to bring together the idea of risk management together with the management of technologies and the way in which they are developed through time. Okay, we've finished on time. I know there are more questions, but Cristina, I don't know if you want to continue. Well, if there's 2 or 3, well, I would ask you for these questions to be, please, short and sharp, as we mentioned this morning. So there's 1, 2, 3, and that's it. Thank you. 4, but it has to be very, very brief. Thank you, Cristina, for your presentation. Very briefly, I had 2 questions. One of them you almost answered, which is the question that has to do with the maritime and air sectors and the speed of implementation of the SAF fuels. You know that this meant a green fee with a big discussion in the EU. And on the other hand, and going back to what my colleague from the Basque Country said, we're also working on the energy efficiency for buildings directive, which affects 36 million buildings in Europe, which I believe is going to be basic and very important for the creation of alternative jobs for the future. That's everything. Thank you. And also in the Canary Islands, we have the only island that is independent, and that is El Hierro.
Por favor, perdón, creo que también Carmelo Barrio.
Carmelo, you also wanted to take the floor? Hello, I'm Laura. I just finished my master's in Brussels, so I was very interested in your presentation, and thank you for sharing the information you shared with us with these graphs. Regarding the third graph, unemployment on renewables, of course, renewable energies are going to create new job opportunities. So I would like to know about your view, and if you know what are the measures both in Europe and in Spain that are going to be put in place regarding gender perspective. That is, not only in Spain, because I've been analyzing the Balkans and there's a inequality in job creation. So I would like to know what are the measures that are in force or that are being thought about. And the second page, and we have the renewables, and I don't understand this difference between Spain and Portugal. Thank you.
Entonces, no, había la tercera toma de palabra era. Ya se me ha olvidado.
Hola.
Hello, very briefly. First of all, thank you. My question has to do with the name of today's presentation and the geopolitical position. And I would like to ask about the 2021-2085 standard on businesses and green hydrogen businesses. And I would like to also ask about the way in which we can have both security in funding, because this is the treaty that allows us to have these companies together with a public-private partnership, and how this can be used as a geopolitical instrument. That is, how these associations with neither member states nor businesses, they can just be a part of other member states, and they can contribute to become another geopolitical instrument.
La palabra.
And one last question. Good afternoon.
Sistema que van a emplear
I would like to know about this system that is going to be applied from the 1st of January onwards regarding the payment of electricity. How is it going to benefit us, and what is the mix that will be taken into account? Sorry, could you repeat this, because I didn't hear the first part of the question. There's a ministry order that says that on the 1st of January onwards, the electricity payment system is going to change. I would like to know how the system is going to be different, and if it's going to benefit us in any way, in general terms. And secondly, green hydrogen with or without a nuclear energy, because France is putting pressure on nuclear energy being used. Is it a clean energy or not? And thirdly, as electricity is a common asset, is this going to be reflected in VAT? If it's going to be, instead of a 21 or 10%, heavily reduced VAT. I have to say that the Commission still haven't been created. So I don't know if she can answer that part of the question. Well, the first question was linked to the new emissions reductions in the air maritime transport, in the transport sector in general terms. As you all know, the big challenge that we have for decarbonization in general terms is transport. Road transport, maritime transport, and air transport. That's where there is a high resistance level of some production sectors, also from the viewpoint of workers and workers' unions, and that's why it has taken so long for Europe to address these sectors that were outside the European regime for CO2 emissions rights, and how to really apply this to biofuels. I believe there are still pending issues that are not minor and that are going to make more difficult for all of this to be applied in an orderly manner. Up to what I know, there is a resistance of the air sector and of the maritime sector, and also of the road transport sector. We're facing big problems here. So that's why the solutions linked to electrification, hydrogen for a long-haul transport, because of scale economies, because hydrogen is expensive to produce. So if we use it, we have to employ it for a long haul. But that's where we still have a lot to be done. First of all, for the transition to be fair, and for the decisions made also from the financial standpoint to be reasonable. So I see that sometimes when we speak about hydrogen, we say it's going to solve everything, but in fact hydrogen is expensive, so the financial balance has to be taken into account, and we need to progress. And biofuels, as you know, is something we have to be very careful with regarding what are said to be sustainable biofuels, so that we don't generate other problems. So this is something that is not consolidated at the energy efficiency for buildings, that in Spain is part of the recovery, transformation and resilience plan, with very high figures on the already existing buildings. There's many households or buildings that are not efficient, and the government and different autonomous community governments and the construction sector will be putting in place employment in the construction sector, but instead of building new homes, they will have the great task of refurbishing homes and buildings so that they are more efficient but also more accessible, because we have an aging population and we have too many buildings in Spain that don't have the adequate access conditions in a developed country. So there's still a lot to be done. There's money coming from Europe, and with energy efficiency of household appliances and homes, we've already progressed quite a lot in the last few years with the categories, making them more simple and compulsory. This is one step more, and the problems won't be as big as with the issue of transport in general terms. Laura asked about the gender perspective. The government has developed all kinds of programs to guarantee equality, wage equality and working conditions equality in our country, and this has been reinforced with labor inspection and the number of inspections that have increased to make sure that the companies that need to have an equality plan have so and comply with it. Other smaller companies seeing if they comply with the demands on equality. In Spain, we also progressed during this political term in the maternity and paternity leaves. We're at 16 weeks and we will get up to 20 weeks. All this no doubt helps the role of women in the labor market, creating conditions for life and work balance, so that it's not only the women that develop specific tasks at home, and we have to continue progressing. As I said before, with accessible homes, we need to have this in place. There's more dependent people, aging people, and usually it's more the women that are in charge of these elders that have difficulties. But in Spain, we are progressing in equality in the labor market, and now we have to make more effort to continue progressing. The difference between Spain and Portugal has to do with our renewables mix, which is different. Portugal is more important than Spain regarding hydroelectric energy that comes from the dams. Aurelio talked about what is going to be published and the way in which we will have prices set from January onwards. I believe that what is known is that the conditions have to be made more clear. If you're using renewable energies, it makes sense that you use electricity at one time or the others. That means that when you pay the electricity you are consuming, we need to be part not only of the problem but also of the solution, to adapt ourselves to consumption at specific hours, and also for there to be higher transparency levels regarding the different elements included in the electricity bill. Something that is not clear. So it has to do with more renewable energy use. I cannot be very specific about this, but I can be more specific regarding green hydrogen or pink hydrogen. That is the name given to it when we use nuclear energy. And France has insisted a lot on these two becoming equal. But in this case, as in others, we need to take into account as European institutions the big difference between France regarding its dependency on nuclear energy. This means that we establish a meeting point in which, yes, there is green hydrogen, but pink hydrogen produced by France will go through the same pipe, at least for some time, that green hydrogen. We have a calendar set for this, and it is considered to be an exception because it's an exception situation. There's no other country in the EU with such a high dependency, and it's a country that we need to provide a response to without excessively changing the definition of renewable energies, because renewable energies by definition are renewable. They're not a uranium or a fossil fuel that is a resource that is not renewable. It's not a resource that generates CO2 when used. It does throughout its life cycle, but nuclear energy has specific consequences, in my view, very important from a democratic standpoint. So let's see if the next generations will be left with a high radioactivity storage area. So we should try and limit this legacy as much as possible. But this is something that we could speak about in the future. Regarding VAT, well, there's going to be an in-depth tax reform, which also involves VAT, and reviewing all the super reduced temporary VATs that we have, for example, for electricity, and try and find the adequate resources so that there is an adequate fiscal treatment. But let's not forget that everyone pays VAT, and when everyone pays, it's a regressive tax because it affects those with a smaller income. So this VAT has to be more efficient than it was up till now. Well, of course, we have many unanswered questions, but I think we've taken enough of your time. I also had some questions, but I won't be asking them. Maybe it's because of my age, but we need to see energy policy from a geostrategic viewpoint, and I always think, well, the founding fathers did something really well. So when we see that we've been able to reduce dependency of Russian gas in the last year from 41% to 9%, and in exchange for this, we are purchasing the LNG. Wouldn't this be a good opportunity to broaden what was done in the past? Because at a common level, we have to see if we can make sure that we have the adequate supply. Yes, I'm going to provide you an answer. And if you will allow me, regarding nuclear energy, something that we mentioned on several occasions, we have this monographic that is dedicated to nuclear energy, more specifically in France, and there is a financial analysis of the different nuclear energy projects that France is thinking about putting in place, and we have the view of different analysts, and we see what's the evolution of nuclear energy in France. Thank you. Big round of applause.